Hey everyone, I'm Hoki, and today let's talk about gearing. In this video, we're going to go over how to get the most out of your car's power in a track setting by adjusting your gearing ratios. Now, although a lot of the things I'm going to go over in this video do apply to both off-road and drag gear tuning, this video is really going to be focusing on tuning your car for circuits and on-road tracks. The drag tuning especially is very different from the tuning we're going to be doing here today. I will be making a drag specific tuning video at some point in the near future. So with that said, let's get into the video, and we're going to start by looking at your power band. Now you can find this graph by just going into the upgrades window, and basically any power setting is going to pull up this performance graph here. Most people will recognize this as a dyno graph. What this shows is how much torque your car is producing through its rev range. This is also called your power band. Now, when most people say power band, what they mean is the rev range at which your car is making most of its power. Technically, the power band is actually the entire rev range, but just keep in mind moving forward with this video that when I say power band, I'm referring more to the optimal rev range at which your car produces most of its power. Now let's look at this graph. You have your RPMs on the bottom and your power figures on the left for both torque and horsepower. And you'll notice that the torque in blue and the horsepower in orange cross at about 5,200 RPMs. To be more precise, they cross at exactly 5,252. And you'll probably notice at some point that they'll cross at the exact same place on your car as well. And that's because every dyno graph, both in real life and in Forza, has the torque and horsepower crossing at 5,252 RPMs. This is because horsepower is nothing more than a calculation of torque. You can multiply your torque by your RPMs and then divide that number by 5,252 and you get your car's horsepower. The reason I'm bringing this up is because a lot of people tend to get tunnel vision and focus only on high horsepower numbers, but it's important to remember that torque and horsepower are closely tied. Now let's look at the graph a little more. You'll see on the right that both lines stop at about 8,400 RPMs. That's your red line. Now in Forza Horizon, your car will keep going for another few hundred RPMs, so make sure you find out where your rev limiter is and shift right before you hit that. Now let's talk about optimal power bands. Now if you drive a manual car in real life, you're probably pretty familiar with this, and even automatic cars will experience this as well. But if you try to accelerate at too low RPMs or too high of a gear, you'll notice that the car really struggles to get going. Your car is going to accelerate a lot quicker at higher RPMs because it's making more power there. So especially in racing, it's really important to stay in that optimal higher RPM power band where your car is making most of its power. It's important to note though that shifting takes time and hurts your acceleration. So as always, we have to come to a balance. You want to shift enough to where you're always staying in your power band, but not too much so that you're always shifting and losing acceleration. Now it can take some trial and error to find your car's optimal power band, and it varies widely from car to car. For this, I'm going to say it's somewhere around 6,500 to max RPM. And that's because my car is making about 90% of its max horsepower at that 6,500 mark. My car's horsepower also does not drop off too sharply under that 6,500 mark, which is important because you won't always be in your optimal power band and you still want a good bit of horsepower to get you out of those situations. So we've done a good bit of talking about this graph and determined at least roughly where our power band should be. So let's go out onto the road and see what the stock gear tuning does and see how we can fix that. Alright, so I'm just checking my tire temperature here because you do want it to be relatively consistent when you're running a couple different launch runs. Otherwise you'll get kind of mixed results. So you can see here that there's a lot of wheel spin. I'm bouncing off the rev limiter, and then things seem to improve quite a bit from about 3rd through 6th gear. And that's usually going to be the case. 1st and 2nd gears are often too short, and then the rest of the gears usually have a pretty good ratio. So let's get to fixing, and we'll start with 1st gear. Now the method I use to tune my 1st gear depends a lot on how much traction your car has. The general rule though that I have is that A-class cars and below should be tuned from either a stop or from 10 miles an hour and lower, and S1, S2, and X-class cars should be tuned from a rolling start of around 20 miles an hour. And what you're looking for is for your 1st gear on full throttle to give you some amount of wheel spin, but not enough to where you're bouncing off the rev limiter. So let's take a look at that here. So again, with the stock tune here, I'm bouncing all over the rev limiter before finally slipping into second. And not only does that create a bad launch, it makes first gear really unusable for things like hairpin corners, because unless you're very good with throttle control, you'll end up oversteering and spinning out. So let's fix this. We're going to go into the tuning window and we're going to start messing with first gear. Now moving it towards speed essentially makes the gear longer, while acceleration makes the gear shorter. And we want to make the gear longer. I'm going to put it at about 2.6 here, and let's do another launch and we'll see how that helped things. Alright, this launch is definitely a little bit better. I'm still bouncing off that rev limiter, but I'm getting a little bit more speed into that second gear. I still need to make the first gear longer though, so I'm going to play with this a little more off camera, and then I'll give you the final number for first gear and show you the result. Alright, so I settled on a ratio of 2.3 for that first gear, and you can see that although I do hit the rev limiter I think once or twice, it's kind of fluttering just underneath it, and that right there is what you're looking for. Now that we have our first gear in a pretty good spot, let's move on to how to tune your second gear. And for this, you're going to need to remember the power band we went over earlier in the video. You'll remember that I said the power band started at around 6,500, and you can see here when I shift into second gear that it starts at about 7,800, which is way too high. And that's mostly just because we've already messed with the first gear, which will throw the second gear off. But let's go back and fix that, and what we're looking for is for it to shift at right around 6,500 RPM. So I'm going to go ahead and make second gear longer, and as I do that you can see that the graph on the right, that red line which represents second gear, is starting lower in the rev range and spanning more of my mile/hour range. Now let's do another launch and see how the car shifts into second gear, and you'll notice here that it shifts just above 6,500 RPM, which is perfect. There's probably a little more room there to go longer with that gear, but I think that felt pretty great, so I'm going to leave it where it is. Now the more my car accelerates and gains speed, the harder it is to accelerate, so I'm going to need to start every gear a little bit higher than the previous one. That means that third should start around 6,800, fourth around 7,000, so on and so forth. Now every car's gearing ratios are going to vary pretty widely from each other, but once you start to play around with this a little bit, you'll start to become familiar with what a good gearing ratio curve should look like. So I'm going to kind of ballpark tune these next few gears, but as I do that you can watch the graph on the right and see that the graph starts very sharp, but as I get higher in the gears it starts to flatten out a little bit. It's important here to consider things like top speed, because having a sharper curve on your graph will mean that you can reach your top speed quicker and easier, but your top speed will be lower. Having the graph flatten out more at the higher gears means that you will have a higher potential top speed, but due to the gears being longer, you might not have enough horsepower to reach the top of your last gear, which means you can't ever actually hit that top speed. Now, once you have a good gearing curve and you've done some test runs and determined that the car doesn't really have any weak points in its power band, you can go to the final drive. What this does is shorten or lengthen your entire gearing ratio without messing with the gaps between individual gears. So if first through sixth, or whatever your final gear is already in a good spot without any weak points in your power band, this won't mess that up. Final drive is a great tuning tool because once you have the rest of your gearing ratios locked in, you can use this to adjust for different types of tracks. On a shorter and more technical track, move it more towards acceleration, but on longer tracks with higher speeds, move it a little bit more towards speed. Keep in mind that small adjustments can make a big difference here. Also remember that rally vehicles prefer shorter gearing, more towards the acceleration side, and that drag tuning is really a whole nother ballgame, and we'll get into that in a specific drag video later on. Alright, and with that said, you should now hopefully have a pretty good understanding of how to tune your car for the track. As always, please feel free to leave me some questions in the comments, and stick around, my next video is going to be about drifting, and it should be a pretty good one, so make sure you tune in for that. Alright everyone, keep enjoying Horizon 4, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks guys.